Everybody. Thank you all for coming out here. It's great turnout for such a cold day. My name is Bruce Dixon. I'm the director of the Seeger Center. And if you've been to Seeger Center activities in the recent past, you saw someone else standing up here introducing himself that way. The former director, Eric Schlussel, got a offer he couldn't refuse from Oxford University, and he's now, as of January, departed for Oxford. So I've been in the job for about a month. And one of my goals as being director is to highlight more the research and academic achievements of our in-house faculty. And so no better way to do that than to begin today with a book launch by Celeste Arrington, who is my colleague in the political science department, associate professor of political science and international affairs, also director of the GW Institute for Korean Studies. And her work is focused on is comparison between South Korea and Japan, and what is to be learned from that comparison. So our plan for today is that she will give a presentation. She and I will have a dialogue for a bit, and then we'll open it up to more broader Q&A. But before turning over to Celeste, I want to introduce our dean, Alyssa Ayers, who was just, I hope celebrate is the right word, celebrated her 5th anniversary as dean of the Elliott School. Before coming here, she was for many years a senior fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations. Before that, working in the Obama administration, a long and distinguished career as a scholar, and now distinguished achievements as a administrator here at the Elliott School. So I'll have Dean Ayers come up first, and then we'll get underway.
Thank you so much, Professor Dixon, and we are grateful that you have actually returned to the leadership of the Seeger Center. And I want to say it's great to see so many people here. We are all about celebrating our faculty's accomplishments. Books take a long time to incubate, so we're thrilled when they come out, as our faculty members are when their books come out. So this is really a moment to celebrate and have a moment of joy. I like to say that one of the great privileges of being the dean of the Elliott School is the chance to see and to celebrate our faculty's research. So I'm really, really delighted to introduce today's book launch event, From Manners to Rules, and you'll hear more about this term from Professor Arrington later, Advocating for Legalism in South Korea and Japan. I also want to offer a special thanks to everyone for making sure you got here in person. It's great to see so many people in person. We've had some weather troubles recently, as you all know. We also had some temperature troubles in our building yesterday, as some of you are well aware. So it's a great moment for us here today. As I mentioned, faculty publications like the one we celebrate today really are the result of years of work, countless hours of research, writing, editing, responding to reviewers, and more. So on behalf of the Elliott School, I want to thank everyone for supporting that work, supporting faculty scholarship, and for supporting our author, Professor Celeste Arrington. Professor Arrington is Korea Foundation Associate Professor of Political Science and International Affairs, and as you heard, Director of the GW Institute for Korean Studies. She is also a visiting research scholar at Princeton's School of Public and International Affairs. Now, the book we'll hear about today, From Manners to Rules, was just published by Cambridge University Press, and it's her second single-authored book. In addition to numerous scholarly and popular articles, Professor Arrington's first monograph, Accidental Activists, Victim Movements, and Government Accountability in Japan and South Korea, came out in 2016. In 2021, she followed Accidental Activists with a co-edited volume, Rights Claiming in South Korea. So this quick review of recent single author monographs and edited volumes shows that she is a longtime scholar of public policy, law, social change, and governance, and the intersection of all of those, particularly in South Korea and Japan. She brings all of that expertise to bear in From Manners to Rules. The book offers a new perspective on the idea of legalism in these countries. It challenges conventional wisdom that law and courts play marginal roles in Korean and Japanese politics. She challenges traditional scholarship that emphasizes the importance of structural factors in the creation of legalism. She constructs these challenges through paired comparisons of recent reforms related to disability rights and tobacco control, and she grounds this comparative research in 120 interviews and diverse documents from advocacy groups, court cases, and government bodies. So as the book's reviewers note, the result is a must read for scholars of Japan, South Korea, and comparative legal studies. From Manners to Rules reveals the growth of what Professor Arrington terms legalistic governance in Japan and South Korea. And it shows how activists and lawyers contribute to that legalism from the bottom up by demanding and using more formal, detailed, and enforceable rules and participatory policy processes. This offers critical insight into how this new legalism is changing the who and the how of policy and transforming Japanese and South Korean citizens' options for political participation. So we are going to invite Professor Arrington to offer a few words about her work, and then Professor Dixon will join her in a moderated discussion of the book's takeaways. Thank you very much, and we are really looking forward to hearing about this. Congratulations.
Thank you very much, Alyssa, for those generous introductory remarks. It allows me to skip through the first couple of slides, so that was excellent. I want to especially thank Bruce and Adam from the Seeger Center for organizing and putting together this talk, which is also co-sponsored by my own GW Institute for Korean Studies. And I want to thank Habin in the back for also helping out today, and for the many visiting scholars, postdocs, and students affiliated with GWIX that I see in the audience today. I appreciate all of you taking the time out of your busy days to come and listen to my presentation. So this new book, as Alyssa alluded to, documents a significant transformation in the role of law and courts in Japanese and Korean politics in the last 20 to 30 years. In particular, I show that there are more detailed and enforceable laws, which are more effectively usable in courts, and that policy design and implementation is becoming more participatory. And to preview the argument, which Alyssa also alluded to, I show that the demand for law from societal groups is a key part of the explanation of why we see this change happening. So activists and lawyers seek out legalistic policy solutions because they increase transparency and accountability. They clarify rights and duties. They specify what types of dispute resolution mechanisms are open, and they increase the accessibility of policymaking to societal actors. To give you a sense, let's see if I can hide this top bar. This is the table of contents of the book. I'm going to illustrate my argument with examples from disability rights today, the part one of the book. I'm happy in the Q&A to talk about the tobacco control portions of the book. Korea and Japan, if I can move the slide now. Sorry, just wanted to make sure you get your exercise today. So Korea and Japan are hard cases in the sense that they historically were known for having non-legalistic governance, especially in social policy. Social norms or non-binding measures tended to be used more often than binding and enforceable laws. And this tended to work for most people in the mainstream. However, not for marginalized groups like people with disabilities. In Korea and Japan, we also had significant similar structural disincentives to using the courts to influence policymaking. And a classic example of the kind of soft law measures that tended to dominate are these non-smoking posters. So rather than regulate where you could smoke, these posters suggest that you should be polite when smoking. And interestingly, the green and white ones up there were funded by none other than Japan Tobacco. Rules are increasingly visible literally on the streets of Japan and Korea, however. So these are non-smoking pictures that I took in Japan and in Korea, and you can see this legalistic turn literally on the streets. Many of them also specify the fines for rule breaking. Although tiny in monetary value, these are supposed to deter smoking on the sidewalks. Japan's Ministry of Health, Labor, and Welfare pervasively uses this phrase mana kara ruru, which is where I draw the title of my book from manners to rules, to describe the strengthening of non-smoking regulations in 2018. The question is, for my book, what is changing in terms of governance or regulatory style, and how is it changing? Why is it changing? To clarify what is changing, I draw on Bob Kagan's classic conceptualization of regulatory style, which describes the who and the how of policymaking, policy implementation, and dispute resolution. And he outlined two dimensions in his comparative research about how regulatory style could vary. So on the one hand, how detailed or formally written down are laws, and to what degree are decision makers operating based on pre-existing rules and procedures when deciding and implementing policy. That's the formality dimension. On the other hand, is decision-making centralized and top-down, often made in smoke-filled rooms by bureaucrats, or is it more contested and open, including to input from the courts? Now, Bob Kagan in his research was mainly focused on the American way of law, which he called adversarial legalism. And what I'm not saying is that Japan and Korea are becoming more like the United States, but that on these two dimensions, regulatory style is increasing in its formality and level of participatoriness, if I can make up a word. So these two dimensions give us a sense of what is changing in the legalization or the broader concept of judicialization of politics around the world. In order to study this legalistic turn, I specified, based on existing scholarship, some of the indicators of legalism. And so these are a few of the examples, like more formal, more detailed, and more codified rules and rights. Sanctions mechanisms for enforcement, legal requirements about who participates in policymaking, and formalized dispute resolution mechanisms. So here's my most scientific graph of the whole presentation. This is very roughly the shift that my book is demonstrating. And in the book, I detail that legalism is increasing in both Japan and Korea, but it has slightly different flavors. So there's like varieties of legalism, to coin a term. On balance, Korean laws look better on paper. They're a little bit stronger and more legalistic, but maybe not as fully implemented. Whereas Japanese laws seem a little bit weaker on paper, but tend to be more fully implemented. And part of this book's effort is to not just look at what was passed, like the law on the books, but how it gets used down the line, and to look at law in action, to understand how regulatory processes and policymaking is changing. So let me get a little bit more concrete with some examples from disability policy. So Koreans and Japanese with disabilities previously had to rely on the good intentions of the people around them. So for example, if you wanted to ride the train, you had to wait for station staff to put on a ramp to get on. And people with disabilities and their organizations argued that these good intentions were not enough, and that the inaccessibility of the public transit environment and the public spaces in general was discriminatory. In Korea, for example, you can see this wheelchair lift down many flights of stairs. In 2001, there were fatal accidents where people in wheelchairs fell off of the wheelchair lifts. And this ignited a mobility rights movement to try to argue that this was not just discriminatory, but very dangerous. They also emphasized, because there were no legal requirements for accessibility, places like this Starbucks in Seoul still had steps and you couldn't get in. And so they used the phrase to make things obligatory, or 의무화 in Korean and 기무화 in Japanese, to argue for legalistic reforms. In the last 20 years, Korean policy related to people with disabilities has become much more formal and participatory. For example, a new law in 2005 codified for the first time a right to mobility, or 이동권. In 2007, a law legally defined and prohibited disability-based discrimination in its indirect and direct forms, and it specified that claims of discrimination could go to the National Human Rights Commission or to the courts. And since 2022, all public buildings larger than 50 square meters have to be accessible. Until then, it was any building over 300 square meters. There are also new mandates for low-floor buses, and the commission that verifies compliance with these standards is required by law to have people with disabilities on it. In Japan, too, we've seen a shift from unenforceable guidelines towards more enforceable legal rules and laws. So, for example, Japan passed in 2013 and went into force in 2016 a law that prohibited unfair treatment of people with disabilities, and it mandated that public entities had to provide reasonable accommodations for them. Since 2021, that law has been revised and extended, so all private businesses are also legally obliged to provide reasonable accommodations for people with disabilities. Transit facilities and buildings also went from having guidelines or non-binding standards to having binding standards regarding accessibility. Policy design and assessment councils, like the Assessment Council on Public Transportation Accessibility, now have to include people with disabilities on them. And 90% of the policy councils related to discrimination in Japan have people with disabilities on them as of 2018. Even the kind of soft law sounding measures, like you need to cultivate barrier-free mindsets or kokoro no barrier furi programs, are now legally required. The UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities bolstered the domestic advocacy for many of these reforms and made it easier for the reforms to be realized, for sure. But the domestic reforms echo some of the rights-based approach that is laid out in the CRPD. This legalistic turn is not unique to Japan and Korea. So, for example, Steve Vogel wrote about in the UK and Japan, as deregulation was happening, often you needed re-regulation or freer markets, more rules. And Dan Kellerman has written about your regional integration in the EU, requiring greater legalism. So the shift towards legal norms through transparent legal rules and procedures and broader access to justice. The existing explanations for this legalization and the broader judicialization of politics, however, tend to emphasize top-down or structural explanations. And as Alyssa hinted at in her opening remarks, my story is one about the bottom-up demand for law instead. So in the existing explanations, they might say that political elites, if they expect to lose the next election, would want legalistic policy instruments in order to tie their successors' hands. Or they might want legalistic policy instruments to cope with the increasing numbers and levels of government and administrative units. Or they might be responding to foreign pressures, such as amid globalization. And these explanations are not wrong, but they pay insufficient attention to the societal demand for law, I argue. In particular, activists and lawyers are the key change agents in my story from the bottom up. So the book traces how activists and lawyers are contributing to gradual institutional and legislative changes that are incrementally reshaping the Korean and Japanese way of law. They are not just advocating for legalistic policy instruments, but actively using them and deepening their impact. This research, as you saw from the table of contents, draws on 4 paired longitudinal comparisons of 2 disability rights cases and 2 tobacco control cases in 2 countries. And sometimes I regret that research design, a little bit complicated. But I'm happy to talk more about that research design. But one of the things that this paired comparison allows me to do is to trace how activists and lawyers are contributing to the legalistic turn and the conditions under which legalism is not advancing. So in terms of the how, I specifically theorized 5 mechanisms through which activists and lawyers are contributing to legalism. And you might think if we're going to hear about all 5, we'll be here forever. So I'm just going to offer examples of 2 of them relating specifically to information. They're highlighted in yellow here. So information subsidies is a term that I use to describe the fact that disabled persons organizations have an unusual opportunity to influence policymaking because policymakers have limited time and staff. And they may not know how users of accommodations will experience those accommodations. So disabled persons organizations and lawyers affiliated with them shoulder the burden of collecting the data, finding examples abroad of policies that have been tried to solve a problem, and often even ghostwriting or drafting clauses for bills to propose. And then during the implementation, they also collect data about its implementation to assess how well the laws are being enforced. The second mechanism that I want to illustrate today is accountability politics, which Keck and Sikkink have used that term. Also in the IR scholarship is known as shaming or naming and shaming. And that is that disabled persons, organizations, and lawyers basically highlight the gap between Japan and Korea's commitments to the international treaty, the CRPD, and actual legislation. So by participating in the UN compliance monitoring mechanisms, disabled persons organizations from Japan and Korea are not only given access to internationally approved language and terms and concepts and deadlines. The reporting schedule has a deadline, but they also build their own capacity to gather information about the remaining governance gaps domestically, and that feeds back into the first mechanism of information subsidies. This process also raises public and, more importantly, government officials' awareness about the remaining gaps in policy implementation. Okay, so let me spend the rest of the time illustrating these two mechanisms from Korea and Japan. In Korea, 65 different disabled persons organizations got together in 2003 to form a solidarity organization for a Disability Discrimination Act. The DDASK, as it was known, then appointed lawyers and disabled persons to what they called a legislation committee. And that committee held hearings nationwide based on two main principles. First, that we need the actual voices and needs of people with disabilities in the draft law that we come up with, and that by involving disabled persons in the drafting, we can build their capacity as citizens. This draft that they came up with, one activist with disabilities who participated in the process described this as turning us from passive consumers into active producers of law. And this draft was then proposed to a sympathetic politician from a tiny left-wing party. And he said, quote, 85% of the bill that I proposed to the National Assembly was the Solidarities draft. So again, here, this is like the activists ghostwriting the law that then proposes legalistic reforms. His bill died in the National Assembly at the end of the session. But when the Presidential Committee on Social Inclusion created a task force to create such a law, they used that original draft as the starting point for discussions. In addition, many of the DDASK members, so lawyers and people with disabilities and also lawyers with disabilities, were appointed to this task force. So they had a direct voice in the process. Information subsidies in Korea have also been somewhat more professional and systematic, I would say, than information subsidies in Japan, in part because Korea has a vibrant public interest law firm and foundation sector. And this does not exist in Japan. And so, for example, since 2015, this organization, the Research Institute for Disability Rights in Korea, has been on an annual basis collecting all of the disability-related court cases from the country and analyzing which ones were progress and which ones were, they called stumbling blocks to advancement of disability rights. For a researcher, these were great. And I want to also acknowledge my research assistant in the back, Benny, an undergraduate, who also read a lot of those reports. So these public interest law firms and foundations bring the interpersonal networks, professional know-how about how to mobilize the law, and funding in order to do the type of research. In Japan, the networks among lawyers are more ad hoc and less visible, although they do some similar work. Okay, these public interest law firms and foundations have only existed since 2004, but many of them also served as the secretariat that got NGOs together to craft parallel reports to the UN Committee on the Persons of Rights with Disabilities, and that challenged the state's report. Another example of information subsidies working well in Korea is the judicial guidelines related to people with disabilities. So disabled persons and lawyers got together, and you can get a kind of numerical sense. Japan's guidelines are 12 pages long, and in 2020, Korea's guidelines were expanded to 225 pages. So these are very detailed, and the court administration is considering making these guidelines legally enforceable, binding on the courts. So these include everything from translators in the courtroom, accessibility, and things like that. This is increasing access to justice for people with disabilities. In addition, as in recognition of these public interest law firms and foundations, the court administration asked the Public Interest Law Foundation, TURU, to go around the country and research the accessibility of all of the courthouses in the country. Again, so the activity is not just changing legislation, but changing the way it gets implemented and how it gets interpreted to make it easier for using the law down the line for groups in the future. Now in Japan, activists and lawyers were also heavily involved in reshaping legal frameworks. They faced more resistance at the national level, so the interesting changes started, which should be surprising to nobody who studies Japanese politics, at the local level. So for example, in Chiba Prefecture, activists and lawyers got together and collected 800 actual cases of discrimination and categorized them into types of discrimination. And in fact, the ordinance of Chiba includes those exact categories that they collected. That ordinance also is quite legalistic in the sense that it formally spells out dispute resolution mechanisms, and it served as a model for other subnational ordinances related to disability-based discrimination. When the Democratic Party of Japan came to power in 2009, this first unusual transition to a non-LDP party gave an opening for the Disability Discrimination Elimination, the Disability Policy Reform Council in the cabinet headquarters to consider creating a new law, which was eventually titled Disability Discrimination Elimination Act. Activists and lawyers were appointed to that headquarters committee, including the secretariat, which is normally a bureaucrat, but a lawyer with disabilities was actually appointed to that committee. And they pushed for, specifically as one activist described, a legally binding law that we can use if real cases of discrimination occur. If you take a look, this bill was passed in 2013, which was just after the LDP was voted back into power. So activists and lawyers were disappointed with the actual contents of the law. Less of it contained their demands for legalistic policy reforms. And so they contributed information subsidies about even this weaker law. How can you use it more effectively? So 19 lawyers got together and published this practical manual on how to use the Disability Discrimination Act. And then they specifically in the introduction say it's important to actively use these laws to give them meaning. One of the problems that they highlighted was that the Disability Discrimination Elimination Act does not allow claims to go to court. Instead, they are channeled to what are called sodan madoguchi, or consultation offices. And these consultation offices have no legal authority to remedy discrimination. So the Disabled Persons Organization, DPI Japan, started a campaign. Let's find out just how ineffectual consultation offices are by actively using them and collecting data about it. And it was called Sodan Madoguchi o Tsukatte Miyo. As you can see, you would have to find the right ministry or agency and then call them or send a fax originally if you experienced discrimination. So it's a little bit cumbersome of a process. As a result, there's now a one-stop portal where you can file online discrimination claims. They also tested proposed regulations and, for example, discovered that the proposed width of a hotel entry way would fit Japanese wheelchairs, but not foreign wheelchairs, which would be a bit of a problem leading up to the 2020 Olympics and Paralympics. Ultimately, there weren't foreigners at those Olympics, but anyway, they changed the width of hotel room entryways. They also collected data about how that original law only obliged public entities, but not private entities, to provide reasonable accommodations, and got the law revised in 2021 to extend that legal obligation to private entities. For example, they said there's already a bunch of subnational ordinances that require even private entities to provide reasonable accommodations. And they argued that the UN CRPD was expecting Japan's first report as a state party to the CRPD. And so this was a deadline. We need to revise the law in time for this report, otherwise it'll be embarrassing. Disabled persons organizations also got together and in order to help the implementation of the law, collected specific examples of what it means to provide reasonable accommodations for people with disabilities. And so these cases are now in a database that's on the Cabinet Office's website, and a business can search up, I'm like in this sector, what are some examples of reasonable accommodations? So they can more effectively comply with these new laws. Okay, and the last example, again, is this accountability politics mechanism. The UN Committee on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities holds constructive dialogue based on states parties reports and the NGO reports. In 2022, there are about 10 to 12 NGOs that submitted parallel reports from each Japan and Korea. And the delegation that went from Korea to the CRPD meetings was surprisingly large, the government officials said, way bigger than we expected. So this accountability politics, the idea here is that politicians, as they're promoting their bills in the National Assembly or the Diet, say we have this deadline, we need to pass the law now. They also use already accepted language and terms from the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, and they can feel the kind of reputational costs of maintaining the status quo. But for disabled persons organizations and lawyers, this process of writing and submitting parallel reports is very useful for building their capacity. It creates a moment for coordination across different organizations that may not agree on what the policy priorities should be, and helps them to gather data that also feeds back into domestic advocacy to highlight the governance gaps that remain. This process also equips them better to serve as teachers to government officials, including judges, about disability law. Like new concepts that haven't been taught necessarily in law school, they can hold seminars for judges and help inform them about how to better implement disability law. So to wrap up here, there's a range of different contributions or conclusions from my research, but I want to highlight three. The first is that governance is becoming more legalistic, although it looks a little different in Japan and Korea, which did not used to use legalistic governance. And you see it across many other social policy areas. So for example, regulating denialism over history was just in the news today. In Korea, it's now punishable to question the comfort women or the sex slaves from World War II, or to spread false information about them. And my second contribution is that in order to understand this shift, we need to look at the bottom-up demand for law. Not just how advocates are pushing for legislative change and better legal frameworks, but are actively using them to make them more meaningful. And so as a result, these activities are gradually reshaping the institutional constraints. And then the third conclusion is that we should not look at just law or courts separately from the policy and the international and the subnational arenas, that the interaction across these different arenas is fascinating and meaningful for example, for the ability of people with disabilities to participate more fully in socio-political life. All right, so those are my opening remarks, which were more than a few words, as Alyssa said. But thank you for listening. You want to?
Thanks for that. You gave us a lot to talk about, even though you had just sure touched at the surface a lot of the issues that you had. Let me begin with the title of the book, of From Manners to Rules, which makes it sound like a very natural evolution, a smooth process. But we know in politics, political change is never natural and smooth. So what are some of the obstacles that these activists had to overcome in order to make this transition happen?
Yeah. So first of all, I end the book in the conclusion by saying maybe it's not from manners to rules, but manners and rules. And part of this was motivated as I was doing the field work. A bus drove by in Tokyo, and on the side of it, it said we should prevent bicycle accidents with manners and rules, like literally the mana to ruru. And I think the reality is a little bit more complicated than the title suggests. So we have more of the rules types approaches to governance, but they coexist and often complement with sort of soft law type manners type measures in regulation. And even if you had the most enforceable hard law type rules, it's impossible to monitor everyone everywhere. So even those still rely on voluntary compliance to some degree. But the obstacles in Japan, there's a pervasive narrative of like we're more of a social norms type of society. And we're not yet ready to, for example, the diet deliberations include government officials saying we're not yet ready to prohibit discrimination. We can work to eliminate discrimination, but we shouldn't yet have a hard prohibition. And so the debates about what types of terms to use was one hurdle. Japanese officials tended to favor sort of more incremental approaches to implementing the law. As nobody would be surprised to hear, the Koreans were like, let's go for it, just do it fast, and we'll deal with how to implement it later. And so the laws, as I mentioned, in Korea changed quickly and dramatically, but then may not have been fully enforced, or may still not be fully enforced. Another hurdle with the shift towards legalism was fear of becoming like the US, like a litigious society. That appears in the deliberations. And so there are like non-court channels that they inserted in to make sure we didn't have an explosion of lawsuits in Korea. The other hurdle is how do you pay for these legal obligations if everybody's obliged to provide reasonable accommodations? Who pays? It actually costs quite a bit of money. And so there were battles over subsidies to help with enforcement or implementation, and how to monitor enforcement also became a challenge. And so there, the partnership with disabled persons organizations, which have increased in their capacity to monitor policy, helped kind of alleviate some of the fears of making things obligatory.
In this area, with cultural norms being one of the obstacles to change, are there certain issue areas or topics that are still off limits?
Yeah, so the chapter about product liability for tobacco products is a big downer. There's not much legalism happening, in part because the Ministry of Finance in Japan still owns a third of Japan Tobacco shares, and the largest shareholder of KT&G, the former monopoly in Korea for tobacco, is the National Pension Service. And they are large, economically powerful companies. There's also a law in both countries that requires the governments to promote the tobacco industry. So there's downsides to having legalism as well. I think in the area of tobacco control, the cultural arguments have really shifted dramatically in the last 20 years. If you have, say, half to three-quarters of men smoking, but only 5 to 10% of women smoking, there's been, like it used to be, we just put up with it, but now there's been more of a shift towards this is not right. And so like in Korea, the big focus on workplace abuse or like seniors abusing their authority over juniors was also wrapped up with this move towards reducing pressure to smoke, pressure to drink, and how the gender dynamics there. In addition, if you served in the Korean military, which all men did, they had tax-free cigarettes until 2009. So the shift away from that has reduced smoking rates and helped alleviate some of the resistance to the tobacco reforms. But making bill or laws that that allow for former smokers or secondhand smoke victims to bring the tobacco companies to court, that has been very unsuccessful. So for example, the Korean Supreme Court just last month ruled that actually there's no evidence of the causal link between smoking and cancer. And the National Health Insurance Service does not have the standing to bring a suit to try to recoup the cost of caring for thousands of cancer patients who used to smoke. So the Supreme Court said no to that as well. That's not culture.
It's institutionalized, that's what we would call that. In the book, you make this distinction between laws on the books and laws in action. As a scholar observing this, how do you study laws in action when you can't be there to see it in person?
Yeah, it's hard, and it is also a good argument for doing long-term, longue durée type research and comparative research. So things that you kind of take for granted in one context only become puzzling if you look at another context, the same process. And so that's the paired part of the comparison. And then the longitudinal is to try to understand how the organizations talk about, write about the reforms that they want to make, how the Diet deliberations or the National Assembly deliberations frame the legal changes. What's the argument for and against legalism? And then once the law is passed, how does it then get used and implemented? And so then I look at court cases over time. And you can see across the court cases over time, in particular, judges kind of learning more. And so one judge told me there are now, I think, close to 50 judges with disabilities, and that they have actually played an important role in educating the judiciary about disability rights. And in Japan also I was in Korea, and then in Japan, just by the act of filing a lawsuit, they exposed the inaccessibility of the courts. So in Kyushu, 4 people with disabilities filed a lawsuit against JR Kyushu over because it violated their constitutional right to free movement by not having accessible train stations. And to file the lawsuit, they had to take it into the courtroom, but that was up steps, and they literally could not access justice. And so they got a bunch of journalists and covered the inaccessibility of the courts that way. And so a lot of it is looking across time comparatively and tracing the actors who are involved, how they're talking about it and how they're writing about it.
Last question before we open it up. You mentioned that your research design, you somewhat regretted in the midst of it, given the complications. But in a positive, what are the benefits of comparing Korea and Japan that you would not have had if you'd only studied one and not the other?
Yeah, I mean, as I mentioned just now, I think things that you take for granted in one context really only become apparent if you study another context. And for many researchers, that's like an implicit process. Say, as an American, I know life in the US, and I go and study Japan, things seem kind of puzzling there. But sort of to try to do that more systematically by comparing two relatively similar national contexts, they have due to Japanese colonial rule, the same legal structures, and due to their alliances with the US, many of the same changes since World War II in the legal profession and the visions of law and thoughts about how to regulate. So these are, I'm trying to hold those things constant and then look at how similarly placed actors trying to solve similar problems may reach slightly different solutions.
As we open it up, two requests. One is that you wait for the microphone to come to you. Is that right, Adam? We're passing it around. And before you begin your question, identify who you are. So Celeste has some idea who she's talking to. So I'll let you pick and choose.
Is the judge going to tell me it's all wrong?
Stay closer. Is it working? Yeah, thank you. Yes, where should I start? Thank you very much for this fascinating book as well as your presentation. I'm a judge from Korea. To briefly give you some context, I was actively engaged in social student movement, like demonstration, and also part of the village fight when the movement was underway. And I told this to Professor Arrington, my wife, another judge, was the author of the decision which recognized that government's failure of making plans or measures having lived on city buses constituted discriminatory conduct. It's cited on our book, but it's in the appellate level, it's overturned, unfortunately. And yes, as Professor Arrington mentioned, there are groups of judges who is coincidingly members of these groups in the Korean judiciary, regularly studying disability law, international human rights law, invite those activists to listen to their viewpoints. So yeah, I was amazed at how Professor Arrington made a wonderful observation of Korean society. So let me. I hope my points clearly conveys to you. I wanted to share my thoughts in three aspects. First,
Do you have a question?
Yes, I wanted to listen from Professor Arrington on my thoughts. First, difference between Japan and Korea. I felt that so in Korea, not only in judiciary or lawyers academy, there are like former activists in the legislative, judiciary, and lawyers. Unlike Japan's Gen-Gongtu society, the generation which failed to translate their thoughts into politics. I thought this makes a difference between Korea and Japan. Korea more readily open to accept radical approaches, thinking that this is more like to borrow the notion of Antonio Gramsci's notion, war of position. They think legal achievement as new position to fight against. So I want to listen from your thoughts on this.
Okay.
Secondly,
maybe we can stick with that one
yeah,
and give
yes.
there's a chance.
So just to wrap up, Koreans still, I feel that Koreans still think law as in the lens of allies and opponents rather than law and order. So they sometimes expect judges to have sideways to give protections more benevolently compared to Japan. let me pause here.
Okay, thank you for your kind remarks. And I agree with you that the activists who are in the Korean National Assembly or in the judiciary now play an important role. And often they are kind of the interpersonal networks. So some of the activists stayed activists and they are now in the mobility rights movement or something, and their friends are now in positions of power. And those insider activists are key to channels for example, the activist group to propose specific language for a law. They'll often do it through their friends. And so that politician from a tiny left-wing party in Korea that proposed the Disability Discrimination Prohibition Act. Originally, he was an activist. And so that's a good example of that. In Japan, there are fewer of them, but they have also used insider activists in the same way. So one of the leading tobacco control advocates was a lawyer. He got the first lawsuit in Japan to recognize secondhand smoke as an occupational hazard. And he was then elected to the Tokyo Metropolitan Assembly, and he served a similar role. He wrote Tokyo's Secondhand Smoke Prevention Act, which is much stricter. So the national law prohibited smoking in any restaurant over 100 square meters, which leaves the vast majority of Tokyo restaurants were not covered by that law, but the Tokyo ordinance covered anybody with an employee. So if you owned your own izakaya, you could expose yourself to secondhand smoke as much as you wanted, but if you had employees, you needed to separate smoking. The reason for that change or difference between the national level and the domestic level was one of these activists, lawyers, who became a lawmaker. So there are fewer of them in Japan, but they play a similar role. And in terms of so you described Korean vision of law as opponents. You're either for us or against us. That applies to most spheres of activity in Korea, in Korean life in general. But with legalism, there's also the possibility of kind of weaponizing law against your opponents. And what I want to emphasize is if for people with disabilities or victims of secondhand smoke, legalism has been beneficial. It's been a net positive outcome, but legalism is not a panacea that solves all problems. In fact, it creates new ones in many cases. And the increasing access to courts means that now businesses that don't want to segregate smoking areas have filed in Korea constitutional court claims that this violates their right to free business. That claim did not work, but anyway, they also used the courts to counter sue. Thank you.
Excuse me. Congratulations, Celeste. My name is Nick Anderson. I'm a faculty here at the Elliott School in Political Science. I wanted to ask about diffusion across the cases or kind of network effects across the cases. So beyond the kind of UN tie, in your research or in the book, did you see, sort of policy change in one country driving change in the other, or vice versa? Yes. Elite level driving it, or maybe activists. Keck and Sicking's book is called Activists Beyond Borders. It's about sort of ties between activists. So to what extent did you see that in your research or in the book?
Lots of it. I'll just give you one example. Historically, Korean policymakers have benchmarked Japanese policies, but with the Disability Discrimination Act in particular, the reverse happened. So the Japanese officials studied the Korean law and looked at what good things can we borrow from it. At the same time, part of why they did that was that the Disabled Persons International Japan branch has an ethnic Korean on its staff, and he has friends in Korea who are in the DPI Korea branch, and they held a joint seminar to share ideas about how to get officials to be more aware of the Korean law. Yeah, there's lots of really interesting examples of this diffusion. And not always in the way that you expect it to go. Yeah. Brandon?
Thanks. Congrats on the book. Celeste, can you give a little more information on the following. So you talk, it looks like a lot of these rights provisions are coming through legislative process, right? Kind of like civil rights acts or civil rights laws. Could you talk a little bit more about how, and you've touched upon it a little bit in the course of Q&A, I think, and some other stuff, but could you touch on whether there are, if there's change occurring in other alternative and maybe more rights protective mechanisms? And specifically, I mean, constitutional, is there a movement to constitutionalize rights, including your cases as well as other cases? And I also want to ask about how the courts are handling how rights protective the courts are. You've given one example on the smoking, which is an interesting decision. But so could you comment on that sort of like, you know, and I'm in the spirit of, is there a movement for even maybe more rights protective mechanisms? Of course, constitutionalizing rights makes them more bulletproof, so to speak. And then the how rights protective the courts are, and also kind of common law. Are there movements for like common law and precedents and legal doctrine building in the courts? Thank you.
Yeah, so unlike the U.S. context, formally, precedents are not binding in the civil law context of Japan and Korea. However, judges do refer back to what prior rulings have said. And in Korea, you have a constitutional court in addition to the regular courts, and you also have the National Human Rights Commission of Korea. So many of these cases, they'll file a National Human Rights Commission claim, which leads to a non-binding recommendation. But that recommendation says something about rights. It interprets rights in ways that can have positive feedback effects into the court process. So again, not just looking at the courts, but looking at the interaction across these venues is important. There have not been formal constitutional revisions. There's not much about disabilities, or there's a right to enjoy life by smoking, which has been upheld by the Japanese courts. Instead, what the courts, for example, in Korea in December of 2024, when some other things were happening, the Korean Supreme Court ruled that the legislature's failure to amend the enforcement decree about which buildings were exempt from accessibility regulations violated not just the Disability Discrimination Prohibition Act, but also the Constitution. And that people with that you shouldn't, even though it doesn't, the ruling says, even though it doesn't formally say so in the Constitution, the rights of persons with disabilities can't be realized unless you provide them with access to realize those rights. And so that was a landmark ruling about legislative failure, but it also said something about how we interpret the Constitution. Mindy? Yeah.
Hi, my name is Mindy Cutler from Asia Policy Point. As a mother of someone with autism, an intern that's blind, and a cousin that is deaf, your focus, so to me, seems on people in wheelchairs. Is there any progress on the other disabilities, the less visible ones?
Yeah. In this book, the balance of focus is definitely on physical accessibility. For example, last year, Korea passed a law to address digitally disadvantaged persons. So since COVID, you've had a lot more of these like kiosks in, say, cafes to order, and providing accessibility to those is now legally required as well as of last year. I think my next project is to research civic participation by people with disabilities, civic engagement, and I do hope to look at differences across disabilities. For example, I talked about how 90% of Japan's policy councils had a person with disabilities. 75% of those had no women with disabilities on them, and only 10% had intellectual or developmental disabilities. They were almost all physical disabilities. And so looking at disparities across types of disabilities is the next project, in a sense. It's a very good point. Yeah, in employment, we had a visiting scholar at the Seeger Center last year who did excellent research on this, Nishida Reiko, in Japan. And in the last 20 years, so in both countries, private and public entities are required to employ a certain percentage of people with disabilities. And historically, that had been primarily physical disabilities. And the laws were, since 1976 in Japan, they were legally obliged to hire people with physical disabilities. So that was an early moment of legalism. But they've added intellectual disabilities and mental disabilities over the years. And in particular, young workers are much more likely to have mental and intellectual and developmental disabilities than older workers. And older workers, just because of the nature of aging, may have new disabilities as they work. And so I haven't looked in this book at all about employment contexts, but it's a fascinating shift in kind of who are the people with disabilities that we're thinking about. So thank you for that point. I'll take one or two. Oh, we got plenty of time. Okay, Christina, sorry.
Hi, thank you, Celeste. Wonderful presentation. I'm Christina Fink, a professor here at the Elliott School, and my question for you is whether you see a broader trend in terms of how laws are made and policies are made. Is this just exceptional that when there's a particular issue, groups are going to come together and try to influence the process, or is there a norm kind of developing that lawmaking should be more participatory, policymaking should be more participatory?
Yeah, certainly on disability policy, there is a global phrase, nothing about us without us. And that is, they didn't have that exact phrase in Japan and Korea, but they were arguing for affected parties to be included, or tojisha in Japanese, or tangsaja in Korean, to be included in the policymaking process even before that phrase existed. And so that's always been an underlying theme here. But the Diet deliberations in Japan and the National Assembly deliberations talk about kind of systematizing that participation. And it is, studies have also shown more generally in Korea that Koreans think about democracy as not like a representational democracy, but more about a participatory democracy. And for those of you who have been there during protests in Korea, like this should not be surprising. But the direct participation is kind of a better way of doing policy. For the tobacco control policy area, it's long been tobacco companies, like the business interests and the bureaucrats. And so opening that up to medical professionals and now tobacco control advocates, and like increasing activism from the national cancer centers in both countries, like policy engagement and advocacy from the national cancer centers has gradually been increasing, but you don't have that kind of underlying assumption that it should be participatory in the same way that you do in disability policy. Thank you. Chong'un?
Thank you very much for your amazing work. My name is Chong Kwon, a postdoc here at the JUIX. My question is related to, have you encountered any divergences among activists or between activists and lawyers when they're trying to create the policy and during the process?
Yeah, as you might expect from human nature, everybody disagrees at some point. There are a couple of disagreements that came out and covering in chapter 4, the mobility rights movement in Korea. They use a relatively confrontational and disruptive approach to activism, which in recent years has led to disruptions and delays in the Seoul Metro, for example, as they kind of engage in protests in the trains. And there are parts of the disabilities community, because as Mindy's question alluded to, there are many different types of disabilities and different needs and interests and priorities. But in Korea, the big debate was like, how 1980s should we be in our protest tactics? Like, should it be confrontational like the pro-democracy movement in the 1980s and out there protesting and blocking buses and creating a big noise? Or should we work through there's another faction that, for example, provides a hotline for if you need legal counsel when you experience discrimination. You can call them in different branches all around the country, and then you get volunteer lawyers who provide you with advice on how to solve this discrimination claim. And there's lots of debates about which is more effective. And at some points they come together and work effectively. So for example, from 2005 to 2007, when the Disability Discrimination Prohibition Act was passed in Korea, there were noisy protests by the mobility rights faction, the radical flank of the disability rights movement, in front of the National Assembly. Actually, they're still protesting there today. But they provided kind of a public reminder while the legislation committee members were participating in the task force. So sometimes they work together like that. The other disagreements that often came up were like differing priorities. And sometimes it's just reality, like if you install tactile blocks on the subway platforms for visually impaired persons to be safer and not fall onto the tracks, as has happened in Japan and Korea, to their deaths, that may impede wheelchair mobility, for example. But there's also disagreements about, we have a limited budget, whose needs should be prioritized. And in particular, education, so special education versus mainstreaming education debates are very fraught. And the other is about institutionalization for people with intellectual disabilities. Japan and Korea both have comparatively very high rates of institutionalization. And in Korea, there's a movement to get people out of residential institutions, but in Japan, that movement does not exist. But there are like a small handful of people who say that the rights abuses that are occurring in residential institutions need to be addressed. And so there's kind of fights within those domains in particular. Yono?
Thank you. I'm Yono Kim, Associate Director of GWIX. Celeste is my boss, so I need to ask a very smart question. I have two quick questions. One is the presidential committee's role. You said the minority party introduced bills, but it was killed. But after they got support from the presidential committee, they seem to get some big support and momentum. So can you elaborate on how the presidential committee decided to get involved actively in this process? And the second question is about the conservatives' view of disability rights in Korea. There's a very famous relatively young politician who is the president of a minority reform party, but who used to be the president of the ruling party under Yoon Suk-yeol government. And he's not a big fan of disability rights, as you know. And he publicly, criticized the disability movement people, and it created a big political controversy. And we have local elections coming up in June, and in 2 years we have, they have in Korea, general elections. And considering this political timeline, do you see any political controversy over disability rights again, and any potential impact on your conclusion?
Small questions. Thanks, Yona. So I skipped over a whole lot of details about the Disability Discrimination Prohibition Act. But in 2002, for the presidential elections, that is when the Solidarity Organization was formed, and the Disabled Persons Organization, 65 of them, got the progressive-leaning Liberal Party candidate who then ultimately got elected, Roh Moo-hyun, to promise to pass disability discrimination legislation. So it was a campaign pledge, and then one of his policy priorities. However, he then decided it would be better, once he was elected, better to empower the new National Human Rights Commission by having all discrimination claims under one law and all go to the National Human Rights Commission. And disabled persons organizations discovered that Korean society was not ready for gay rights to be included in that general anti-discrimination law. And so it kept getting blocked by conservative Christian anti-gay rights, LGBTQ rights groups. And so the Nomuhyun administration was not making any progress. So the Disabled Persons Organization decided to carve off just disability-based discrimination. And they filed a National Human Rights Commission complaint. And one of the lawyers from that Solidarity's legislation committee happened to be a commissioner on the National Human Rights Commission. And he got the National Human Rights Commission to recommend that the Korean government pass a Disability Discrimination Act. That was shortly after the law, the bill proposed by this tiny left-wing party lawmaker died. So even though it died, then the National Human Rights Commission stepped in, and that added, not legally binding at all, but political pressure for the Presidential Committee on Social Inclusion to address what they had promised to do back in 2002. And that was enact legislation prohibiting disability-based discrimination. So again, if you were to just look at what's happening in the legislature, you would miss the action in these other venues. In terms of the conservatives' view of disabilities, there was a lot of media coverage of this politician's very critical remarks of the metro protests that I mentioned that were disrupting commuting hours. And his remarks were hateful, to put it bluntly. But historically, the Conservative Party has had several visually impaired lawmakers in it, and they have deep ties to the people with visual impairment, the organizations of people with visual impairments in Korea. The physical disabilities, especially the sort of more protesty, I described as the radical flank, have better ties with the progressives and the liberals. But currently, Lee Jae-myung himself has a workplace related disability. And there are lawmakers in both parties who have, over the years, played important roles in coming together to propose disability-related laws. And often they're seen as like they have expertise because they have disabilities themselves, and they should be the ones proposing the bills. And so Benny has also been helping me to collect data on lawmakers with disabilities over the 20 to 30 years, and which committees they're on, what types of bills they've been proposing. And I'm writing a paper right now trying to analyze, is this impression that lawmakers with disabilities played a special role correct based on the data? So stay tuned. Yes. Richard?
Congratulations, Celeste, again on a great book. Richard Haddock, Assistant Director of Seeger Center. I wanted to ask and learn more about the laws and action portion that you and Bruce have been talking about before, maybe about the implementation and regulation about what happens after. How can these efforts still be sustained? In your study, did public administrators play any significant role, either frontline bureaucrats or agencies that can work in tandem with activist lawyers, or how do they fit in this equation that you lay out for us? Thank you.
Yeah, it's a great question, and I can see from your dissertation topic why you're asking me this question. I did not spend, to be honest, I did not spend a lot of time researching public administrators across all of the cases. However, in implementing the secondhand smoke prevention reforms in Korea and Japan, public administrators, in designing those reforms and then implementing them, they did play an important role. In particular, there were a few, I was describing insider activists, like people who were involved with the movement, but then got elected to office. there were also some people who had been involved, say as a doctor, with raising awareness about secondhand smoke previously, that then got hired by the Ministry of Health, Labor, and Welfare in Japan, and then were the key person to write the regulations. Some of those key players, even though they're not elected, play a similar kind of insider activist role. They are open channels. They may have interpersonal connections to the activists that make it easier for the activists to deliver their information subsidies. And they understand the problem in a way that your sort of generalist bureaucrat may not. In terms of the, you talked about the judges study groups, you know, in Korea where they're trying to learn about disability law. There are also public interest lawyers or human rights lawyers in both countries hold seminars for public administrators to try to raise awareness about new disability related laws and how to better implement them. So these are kind of more of the street level bureaucrats. That through that pedagogical exercise, the law becomes more meaningful and deepens because then it can be implemented more effectively. And then the final role for public administrators in implementing Japan's secondhand smoke prevention regulations. So the law went into force in April 2020, banning indoor smoking in most places or requiring it to be separated. And if you think about what was happening in April 2020, public health administrators, the enforcers of that new regulation, were all busy dealing with COVID. And so tobacco control groups mobilized individual citizens to kind of step into the gap and help police which restaurants were implementing the new regulations fully and which weren't. And so the advocacy, the Japan Society for Tobacco Control printed out business cards that customers could either praise or condemn the implementation of new smoking regulations at the restaurants that they went to. And so this kind of created a public pressure, again, not based on any kind of legalism per se, but they were using the power of consumers to help and fill the gaps of enforcement.
Let me ask a final question. And you've alluded a couple of times to your current research, and anyone who's published a book knows that the research and writing took place long or ended long before the book actually comes out. And so between the writing, the editing, the reviewing, the production, it could be a year and a half, 2 years since the work in this book was done. So give us a teaser on what's coming up.
Yeah, and since you're in my department, I especially should have a good answer. No, I'm just kidding. Yeah, part of my feeling is that there's a lot of material in hidden folders in my computer that did not make it into the book, as long as it is. But my current projects, I mentioned this data that Benny has helped me to collect about lawmakers with disabilities, and sort of some of the patterns of representation, so descriptive representation of disabilities in politics, people with disabilities in politics in Korea, and what the implications are for political behavior and policy. Another short book that I'm writing is about laws related to historical and collective memory, and I'm working on this with Claudia Kim in Hong Kong. And this is focused on Korean memory laws. So there have been the rise of a number of laws that punish denialism over different periods of history. So going back to the Japanese colonial era, I mentioned sexual slavery. Spreading false information about comfort women is now punishable, but also some of Korea's authoritarian past. It's now punishable to, for example, claim that the pro-democracy movement in Gwangju in 1980 was not fully a pro-democracy movement, or to question the veracity of those activists, the legitimacy of those activists. And then the third major project, which should hopefully be a full book, is to look at the patterns of civic engagement and political participation, not just voting, but also filing lawsuits or signing petitions by people with disabilities in Korea and Japan, and to look at what explains the shifting, what hurdles remain to their full political participation, and in what ways have they been able to participate more fully in the political process. And part of that is also researching their sense of who they are as citizens and their rights consciousness or their legal consciousness, which is kind of their view of some of the legal changes that I describe in this book. So it's kind of like the next chapter or a whole book. Thank you.
Congratulations again on the production of the book, and thanks for inspiring such a thoughtful discussion here today. So please join me in thanking Celeste.